two reports, including the Crime Survey and MOPAX, have said that there is, contrary to what we might be saying, that there is a lessening of public concern about antisocial behaviour. I think you might already have answered bits of that, but can I ask maybe Paul to start with? Do you think that's right? Do you think there is a lessening? And if there is, what is the evidence for it?
I think it's probably been lessened because some people are dealing with it very effectively, which have been shown through Peabody. Some people are not dealing with it at all, so people are just fed up with reporting it, so there's been a decrease in numbers. And I think that's the complexity of antisocial behaviour. There's not one answer fits all. I think some issues are no longer as problematic as they used to be. There are other issues that weren't problematic in the past which are now a major issue in certain London boroughs. Things like rough sleeping, street drinking, prostitution is on the rise. So I think it's a forever moving animal, antisocial behaviour, and that's why, unless you've got data to tell you what does the picture look like at this moment in time in London, you tend to react to people's opinions and historic information to tell you what the problem is, and that's why we tend to get it wrong, because we're dealing with an untrue picture.
So, sorry, rough sleeping is actually categorised as antisocial behaviour?
It can be. It's obviously, the vulnerability of it is obviously paramount, and we identify that. And those of us that work in antisocial behaviour, we don't criminalise people for rough sleeping in any way whatsoever. But there is problems with rough sleeping, and there's aggravating factors in relation to that. And we sometimes have to deal with that, because our responsibility is not only to the victims and the perpetrators, but obviously to the wider community and how it impacts on that. And I think what we don't want to do is, and I think what we're tending to go back to, which through the lessons of the Together campaign in the early 2000s, was we use enforcement action far too quickly. And I think it's about problem solving. It's about looking at the location, the individuals that are involved, and how best can we deal with the underlying issues that are causing the problems. And I think the agenda has reverted back to a statutory organisation response and housing providers, rather than in the past we had businesses. The Charlton Athletic Community Trust, when I worked with it, was responsible for the KICS project. They reduced antisocial behaviour in the borough of Greenwich by 28%, not by enforcement, but by intervention and early intervention and prevention. So again, I think that we haven't got a true picture, and because of that, we're dealing with it in the wrong way.
Can I just comment on your question about rough sleeping, because it's right that rough sleeping of itself isn't categorised as antisocial behaviour by everyone, although some will categorise it as antisocial behaviour, but it's an example of low impact antisocial behaviour which then has a knock-on impact and which can escalate if left unenforced. And I don't mean by litigation, but enforced by partnership working and other interventions. So rough sleeping, for example, has knock-on impact in terms of littering, potential drug use, which is potentially connected to thieving in the local area, potentially connected to drugs paraphernalia in the area, and so it goes on. And so if we don't deal with some of the lower impact issues, we are allowing them to escalate to a point where then there is a need for enforcement, whereas perhaps there could have been a different way of managing if we'd gone in at an earlier stage. So that partnership working is crucial. Just on rough sleeping. The other thing just to note is that there was an attempt to include rough sleeping in one of the London Local Authority's public space protection orders. And you may recall that there was a large public outcry in relation to that. And Liberty and others were involved in objecting to that having been done, and so that order was withdrawn. But it is a problem for the reasons that there are other acts of antisocial behaviour connected to it, and that rough sleeping is just one example of where there are knock-on impacts.
Thank you. Sorry.
Yeah, just to answer your direction of your question in terms of the public perception of ASB. Yeah. We've recently conducted a number of street surveys in Hammersmith and Fulham, asking people their views on crime. And if you ask it as a spontaneous question, without any prompting, ASP doesn't really get much in the way of mention. If you put it on a prompted list, it rises up. And I think this is partly because the fact is, if you overlay ASB on a map, you get hotspots. I mean, they are concentrated in areas, ASB concentrated in areas of a borough, which means that other areas of the borough do not have the same level or thinking of ASB. And therein, I think, lies the rub, that for the majority of people, it's at a low level in their minds spontaneously. If you prompt them, Yep, okay, they can start to engage with the notion of ASB. We haven't yet moved our survey into what I describe as the hotspots, and it'll be very interesting to see the responses we get when we actually move into hotter ASB areas.
But don't you think, though, when you say that they have to almost be prompted, or that it doesn't come up, ASB, much, could it just be that people have got used to it? I mean, this happens with, you know, if you'd gone back to sort of like 30, 40 years, people might have said, oh, drugs are a big problem. Now, everyone is inured to it. I mean, and they probably don't mention it anymore. Do you think
I'm sure that's a possible factor. Yes, I think that's probably a factor. But I think equally, for a lot of people, it's not, when you give them an open-ended question on crime and safety, it's not top of their list.
I mean,
is this,
can I ask, sorry, perhaps Molly, is this, there is this perception that it's no longer such a, you know, concern. Is this just in London, or is it a national thing? I mean, how do we figure, as it were, in London? Is there less concern in London?
Do you know, I couldn't answer that, and I think that probably the reason for that is that we don't have the surveys, or I don't think that's a known quantifiable thing. I think one of the other challenges is that we call it antisocial behaviour, so there's a sense of this is happening out in society, and so this is affecting everyone, but actually a lot of it, particularly noise nuisance, does affect really localised communities, but the issue of perception is still really relevant in terms of that thing is going on there, or these events are happening, but how are people impacted? What is their anxiety in that moment? So I think it's a really hard question to.
Maybe you can just...
Sorry, so my organisation works across England and Wales. We represent around 250 housing associations who manage 3.5 million housing properties, so a fairly substantial amount of the social housing properties in England and Wales. And certainly before I came here today, I spoke to some of our London members to get a bit of a flavour about some of these questions. And certainly they were saying, although I don't know the methodology around how they do it, that when they do their questionnaires with the residents, ASB is coming top alongside disrepair. They're their two issues in terms of housing management. And certainly that is the same that we hear across the whole of our membership. Across England and Wales, our social housing tenants are still saying that ASB is an issue. And I think one of the things that we haven't spoke about, and it's really important that we raise it at some point, is the impact that austerity has had. So we've seen neighbourhood policing decimated, we've seen local authorities cut to the bone, we've seen housing currently going through efficiency savings because of the rent decrease policy and the fact they've had to lower their rents, which is their main source of income. And actually, I think in the sector there is a real concern that priority is off ASB, it's now on modern slavery, CSE, understandably, but that actually if we take the priority and the focus off ASB too much, we're going to be at the start of another roller coaster where we could unfortunately end up with a Fiona Pilkington case before the focus comes back on again. And as professionals who are very passionate about what we do, that is absolutely the last thing we want to see happening.
Can I just come in on perception as well? Because I think part of it is when you ask a member of the public, well, are you affected by antisocial behaviour? I think to an extent that's the wrong question to ask, because would they categorise littering as antisocial behaviour? Would they categorise seeing the discarded containers of legal highs antisocial behaviour? Would they categorise seeing syringes and baggies antisocial behaviour? Perhaps there is a sense of them becoming immune to it to an extent, but I think it's also about how we ask the question, because they aren't necessarily going to consider that those things, for example, are antisocial behaviour.
Can I ask, I mean, if I can just be indulged here a bit, Steve, you know, you mentioned about hotspots, but it seems to be one of the flashpoints of antisocial behaviour is the public transport system. And I wondered, therefore, you're talking about the problems of reporting. How actually do people actually report things that happen on the train or tube? I mean, at least in my experience, you know, commuting, going around London, a lot of antisocial sort of things I would call antisocial happen on public transport. I mean, you know, if I could just explain, I mean, you know, in the past life as a journalist, I did a big feature about anti-social behaviour on transport. The whole point of it, taking my life in my hands really, was to actually sort of like ask people to stop doing things, as it were, in the most courteous way possible. And what that was things such as speaking incredibly loudly on a mobile phone, which seems to be endemic now, often using really violent language, I mean, profanities and such. I would call that antisocial behaviour. But there seemed to have been some kind of moral inversion. I was the rude person for asking, you know? I mean, I don't know whether this is something that you recognise, this situation, that somehow or other people have now a kind of sense of obliviousness about the public sphere. I mean, particularly in relation to transport is what I'm talking about.
If you remember back, I think it was 2011, Transport for London did a big promotion across the underground in relation to not putting feet on seats and things like that, which actually worked. And I think what we tend to forget with antisocial behaviour is most people don't do it purposely. They do it because of an underlying issue in their lives, whether it's mental health vulnerability, whether it's alcoholism, whether it's unemployment. There's something that's going on in their lives that's making them antisocial to other people. Now, there are people that go out there and purposely be antisocial, and we can deal with that through enforcement action. But I do think it's about education, and it's about talking about respecting others and sort of getting people to think first before they actually do things. And in the early sort of 2000s, I designed a concept called acceptable behaviour contracts. And that was about us not only talking to people, but also listening to people and finding out why they were causing problems in the first place. And I think most people didn't realise there was consequences to their actions, especially young people. And we had about a 90% success rate, mainly because there was a consequence to their actions if it was going to continue. But I think it was about building relationships, and it was about talking to people and telling them what impact their behaviour had on other people. Now, again, I emphasise that a small percentage will go out there and they won't care anyway, and they'll still be problematic. But we've got enforcement action to do that. And if you look at the new tools and powers, the civil injunction is available to Transport for London, so they should be using them. It's also available to the British Transport Police, so we shouldn't be just relying on the Metropolitan Police in London to do this. So there's a number of people actually that now have availability to use these tools and powers. NHS Protect is another one, for example. So why are we not holding these people accountable as well? Not for going for enforcement action, but just joining the table and problem solving some of these particular issues. And where necessary, in the small minority cases where we have to take action, they are equal partners in that process. Well, the Home Office did some statistics on it, and they found that about 83% of all antisocial behaviour was dealt with effectively through 3 interventions, and that didn't have to result in enforcement action. And I think what we've done is we've gone straight back into the old days of together, where we tackle and we don't tolerate antisocial behaviour.